And what I've realized, and this probably applies to artists, is the more experience you have, the more you've been doing a profession, the more you've engaged and seen things, read things, you have this huge back knowledge, in your unconsciously in your mind and your brain, of course, that can come up with things. Things can
Oh,
surface
yeah.
that allow you to be creative and put things together. Um, and so I think it's just I wouldn't have described myself as a creative scientist early in my career, but now I feel I've done a number of experiments and things where I'm quite proud of what we achieved.
So great to speak to you, Hugo.
No, I enjoyed watching your podcasts and the videos of guests. So it's I feel like I'm a very different type of guest to most of your guests,
But
but so that's quite special.
yeah, but it's almost, I want to, after speaking to so many artists and different forms of art, and I always think afterwards, I wonder how they see the world, or how they think, or what made them, so you always think there's something else in people that make them pursue this art form, or also sometimes the way they choose the instruments, and what makes them. So there's always different things for me that I think about, and I always interested to find out, maybe you have answers as a neuroscientist.
Yeah, I've done a bit of work around these topics, but yeah, not as much as I wish I had time to do. But yeah.
But I saw the video that you sent me about painters and architects, how they see the world. So tell me a little bit about that experiment that you did.
Sure. We were just curious about the way in which different professions sorry, let me start that again. We're curious about the way in which the profession somebody chooses might impact the way they think and what they look for in the world. And three particular professions were kind of stood out. Artists who paint, so the painters who are working on a flat canvas, typically, sculptors who have to make a three-dimensional object, and then architects who have to build an entire building space. And they all share the same challenge of working with space, and structures and shapes, and colors, and all the challenges that artists deal with. But their sort of end goals are slightly different, and the outcomes that they're trying to chase are slightly different. So I had a suspicion that they might look at things slightly differently, or conceive of things slightly differently. So we went about that by showing them images, so images of spaces, and just asking them very simple questions like, describe what you see in the space or in the picture. And if you had to transform this space, what would you do to transform it? And then a very broad, can you just tell us what space means for you? And so then you get these long interviews with lots of information. And back when we published this in 2018, there was no clever analysis software for audio. So there was a lot of careful transcription and going through word by word what these different people said. And so some of the key findings from that. So, for example, the pictures would include, a photograph of a street in London, a piece of famous artwork of a picture into the Vatican, like a painting. Another was a very sort of virtual reality style imagined space that wouldn't really exist. So sort of bits and pieces of material put into the image. So it contained different types of media, different types of images. It wasn't just a simple, here's a view into a room. It varied what we were showing. But the main outcome from doing that was that the architects were really, when they look at a space and an image, they're really interested in the paths through the space and how people move around through that space in the architect's mind. Like, how has it been designed for movement and flow? Whereas the visual artists, the painters, would typically be thinking immediately about the foreground and the background. There's a lot of
Oh, yeah.
variation in there, but
Mm.
typically they would be thinking about it. And the sculptors were fascinatingly somewhere between the two. They might think about movement around in the space a bit more than the painter would. So already there was this sort of difference just by, here's a picture, can you tell me about it? It immediately elicits, based on profession, different ways of conceiving the space. What is
Oh,
it
yeah.
you're looking for in a space?
Mm.
And then the thing when they asked the question, what do you think about space? What we found was that the painters would talk much longer than the other professions.
Really?
Yeah, it fascinated me. It felt like the people who chosen to go into painting were just had a lot more to say about space than
Mm.
the others. I mean, that could just be the sample we had. We tested about 16 people in each group, so it was a good number, but
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
may have just happened to pick up on visual artists, painters who were really quite talkative.
Mm.
So somebody would need to replicate that effect. Um, but it has been my experience of working with architects and painters that painters, the ones I've worked with, have a lot to say. They have a lot to say about space. They're really fascinated about trying to create a three-dimensional space on a flat surface is a different type of demand, and this causes a lot of reflection and thinking, I think, for those artists. So it was a real joy to run that study, and it was a kind of collaboration between an expert on discourse analysis, because that's what we were looking at, the
Um,
discourse, and a student who came to me who'd said, "Oh, I've always been fascinated by these topics. Is this of interest?" And I had previously made recordings with artists about their conceptions of space, but never done anything with it. So it was a really great to have this. So the student was Claudia Cileone, and the academic researcher in discourse was Torrid Tenbrink, who's at
okay.
Bangor University. So three of us came together to work on this project, and it was,
Amazing.
yeah, really
Mm.
fun.
I watched when I watched the video. I also thought of the painters and the architects that I spoke to, and it also I remember then also just recently after or before I watched the video, I spoke to an artist who was actually a child prodigy. He was painting since a very, very young age. And I actually asked him, how does he see the world? Does he see the world as a painting? And he said, yes, he absolutely looked at the world as a painting. And I found that so fascinating. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, this was very interesting finding that because it also makes you think then, but because it's true, I can imagine, like you just say, the
Hmm.
movement through space, because that is what they are creating a space where the painter are just replicating the space, really,
Hmm.
so.
That's
But
right. There are different
mm,
challenges there. No, I mean, I think there's a deeper point with this as well, is that what you choose to do in your life, the experiences you have, what
mm,
training you choose to get, shapes your thinking. You look at the world differently, and there has not been that much research on this topic, surprisingly. There's long stories about, if you grow up in certain languages, that are famously, but I'm not sure it's really true, but there are many words for snow in the Inuit culture, because snow it's a really important part. So certainly they do have different types of snow, and they have a real focus on it. So it just means that for a Westerner coming to find land in a snowy north, I wouldn't understand the differences in the snow. So I can't. All I'm seeing is just snow.
yeah,
But an expert can see five different types of snow
yeah,
in that landscape, and it has different meaning and understanding. And that seems obvious, but what was less obvious is the fact that um, just choosing to become a teacher or a taxi driver or what may be will likely shape the way you look at a photograph and the way
of
you want to
course,
talk about it. So,
yeah.
or if you're going to express or think about changing the world, again, it
Mm.
would shape the way you approach that problem. So I think and it has caused me to self-reflect on. I'm a neuroscientist, and it certainly shapes some of the thinking I have about the world.
Yeah, of course, and uh, this makes it then also with what I've been thinking about, that the way we see art or the way that we value art, that if we the moment you start playing the piano, you look at a pianist in a different way, or you will go to a concert and value the work that he's doing. And it's the same with art. You know, the moment you look at, or the moment you are painting and or understand what the process is, then it makes you also value it in a different way.
I agree 100%. Yeah, it's a really, really good point. That appreciation of the artistry and the technical skill really feeds into your, the awe. I mean, one of the great, really, I mean, it's a useful word, awe, for like really profound experiences we might have with art would be described as awe. And if you have an understanding of the challenge of what you're seeing, of producing that, it can really add to that depth of experience, can't it?
Mm. But you've also now recently done other experiments about spatial awareness. Am I right?
Yeah, my whole career has been on kind of how we represent space, how our brain helps us know where we are, and then where we want to get to. And just imagining spaces and recalling spaces we've been in the past. So I've really focused on space as a topic. But it's let me do ask lots of different questions and go to different places. And I've been very fortunate. I've been very lucky, I think, in the experiences I've had through the research we've done on space. It's everywhere. It's got lots of features to it.
But space, why does it interest you?
I think in the world, in some ways, you could say the world around us and inside us is composed of three things. There's space, time. If you're, they're linked, of course. They're different dimensions of reality. And then there's the things that occupy, the atoms, the things that occupy the space or within it form the space. And so time is tricky. It's a really tricky one. You can't see time in the same way. So space provides this amazing sense of, you can measure spaces and explore spaces and, spaces in everything that you can see. It's just super fundamental. If you start thinking about what is reality and what is there, space is at the heart of what exists. And then I think for me, when you start thinking about space, it comes into things like maps. Maps are representations of space. And I always find maps fascinating about the way we're trying to show something that you can't see in some other format. It's not one-to-one, it's at a different scale. And how do I relate to this entity of a map? Cities are fascinating places. There's a lot of things happening in cities. Fundamentally, they're spatial. A lot of the things we think about in geography, space is a huge factor. In psychology, it's a huge factor. For art, it's for architecture, it's the heart of architecture. You're creating space. If you think about what you're doing, you're making a building, but the building itself is not the interest. It's the space that it allows.
Of course, yeah. I haven't thought of that, but yeah, that's true.
So for me, it's such a sort of not talked about because it's so fundamental a topic. And the other thing that lured me into this area was the discovery that there are brain cells that we all carry inside our head that have been mainly studied in other animals that kind of build a map of the world around you inside your head. So when you're finding your way around, not everyone finds their way around easily. Some people are amazing, but if all of us will have some sense of where we are in our house, for example, where we live, and we now know a lot about these cells in our brain that allow us to map the space. And I think it's not just they exist, but they're fascinating. The things they do are really amazing that have been studied. So, for example, one of the studies we found looking at these cells is that they create a map as an animal will walk around in space. They'll form a map, a sort of a "you are here" signal. So different groups of cells inside the hippocampus, this is the key bit of the brain for memory in space, will get excited in different places. And if you listen into thousands of them, you can work out exactly where that person or that animal is from their cell. It's incredible. So they form a map as you walk around. But what we found in recent research was that if an animal can see somewhere that it can't get there, but it can see into somewhere it'd like to go, when it goes to sleep, it starts to create the map that will exist in the future during its dreams.
Really?
Yeah, it's a really strange kind of phenomenon. So it's the
Amazing.
brain is kind of constructing all the time as we're having this conversation. It's, photons in my eye and auditory information going in my ears, but it's a huge amount of work the brain does to construct the world. It does a lot of that on the fly in the moment, but it's also doing it during our sleep. We're sort of, if you if you visit a new city or a new town you've never been to, you'll have a lot of expectations unconsciously about what you expect to
Yeah.
see, how it's going to form, what's going to happen, and a lot of that is built up over lots of experience. But it seems like our brains represent the way in which our brain maps space, does remarkable things while we're asleep. So I found that whole field of studying how the brain represents space just really amazing to be involved in, and to make new discoveries and read new discoveries and have that understanding when I open up a research article. What is this saying? What is the excitement here? It's a real privilege to do that after years of training. But yeah, and hopefully with
Yeah. And
interviews like this, yeah, go on. Sorry.
but would this be then also that when when they say, okay, you have a dream or you have a wish, that you do something or that you be somewhere, that the brain then already maps out this route for you to go there?
Yeah, that the data we collected, we can't directly link that, but we can say it's certainly consistent. So it's the idea does fit with that idea that our brain, you might have a difficult day and your brain kind of goes back and creates some strange experience linked to what you had. And so this discovery we made does suggest that some of that may be creating things for the future. And it's not clear that the organizing the sort of recreating of the maps for the future is dreams. It might not be dreams. It could be something totally separate to dreams. It's hard to relate because it's very hard to study dreams. But it may be. It could be that this is what happens. So there's a lot more to be discovered. We're still, each of these studies takes many, many, many years to complete and to understand and to look over the data, like the brain cells that are firing away and understanding what they're doing.
Well, I can tell you, I people make wishes on my channel, and then for what they wish for the future. And there was a musician in Nigeria, a composer. He's self-taught composer, and he made a wish on, and this was about 3 years ago. He made a wish to say that he wants to go to Europe to study composition. And actually, a year ago, he wrote to me and said that he got a scholarship in Italy to go and study composition. So I think that's the map. His brain made that map to Europe already.
Yep.
When he made that wish.
I think it's true. Something I found some people can visualize things in their mind. So I can see images in my mind. Some people can't. It's described now as aphantasic. So you can't see, and some artists who paint, they're aphantasic. They can't see anything in their mind, but they're still able to create the most beautiful artwork. But for me, as someone that can visualize, that story you've just told me, I think if you can imagine in your mind's eye what that might look like as well, there's a sense in which you are setting up for the future. If you can imagine yourself doing something, it makes these things more likely to happen. And I think it's your brain preparing itself for the future and guiding you a bit. But maybe it's deeper than that. I'm a neuroscientist, so I can measure things, and we should be open to the fact that there's more going on than we think.
But you also, I heard an interview that you did, and you talked about the grit, that the people who live who grew up in the city and people who grew up in the countryside. So tell me about that experience.
Yeah, we were again very fortunate. So in 2016, I was funded by Deutsche Telekom, or T-Mobile, they wanted to put some funding into a project to make an early assessment tool for Alzheimer's disease. So we were very fortunate because they provided substantial funds to make a big difference in that case. The funds that we had went into two really key things as a scientist I don't normally ever get access to. One was to hire in a really top-class computer video games company, a company that can make a video game for smartphones. And it was this company that built the smartphone that created a test of navigation that we were able to distribute to 4 million people around the planet. So the app we made was called Sea Hero Quest, and the company were called Glitchers. I was still working with this company, Glitchers. And they had incredible expertise at creating a really compelling experience of navigation. And the idea was, if we can make a really fun video game that people between the age of 5 to 85 would enjoy playing, then we would have done well. And when we launched this application on the App Store, we hoped to get maybe 100,000 people over a year to take part. And I think we'd had 100,000 people take part within 4 days, because the funding wasn't just for the game to be built, but advertising. So Deutsche Telekom made something happen there with a real push in philanthropy to say, look, what have we got we can do? We've got a telecoms network. We'd like to create an app. So the app Sea Hero Quest has been extremely helpful. And as you introed, one of the really key findings we had with that project was to just simply, the game, you play a little boat, you drive around, you motor the boat around exploring islands, trying to find mystical sea creatures. And you win stars and you can upgrade your boat and so on. It's a full game. But we also asked people demographics. So, you male or female, what's your age? And one of the key questions we asked was, did you grow up in a city or outside a city? Different, suburbs or rural. And crucially, we found that growing up worldwide across all the different countries, and we had 4 million people in the end, so a very, very, very large sample that we could look down carefully within. We found that people who said they grew up inside cities performed worse on average than people who grew up outside cities. And so, sometimes these effects can be very small, but for the effect of cities, it was on average about a 5-year difference. So if you think about your navigation skill, it tends to decline as you get older. That growing up outside a city offsets that decline in cognitive ability by 5 years on average. But then we noticed that this really mattered in some countries more than others. So the United States, for example, and Canada, I'm trying to remember some of the key countries, like maybe Saudi Arabia. There were some countries where it had a bigger impact growing up outside the city. And
would that be because the cities are so big, or
well, that was the thing we were able to look at. So what was great was, once we had that information, we could look at, for a given country, how big the cities are. We could look at quite a lot of factors around what made a difference with the cities. And the key variable we found was how gritty they were. So if you think about Manhattan in New York, it really is it's a rectilinear grid. And it's very easy to find your way. So you want to go to 22nd Street, you're on 5th Street, you just walk 2 blocks and you walk along. It's very easy to navigate in Manhattan. But if you go to Prague, let's say, it's quite a windy city. And Rome is a great example. Rome is really not a grid. Rome is spread out. It's a very, very old city. So what we were able to find was there was a strong correlation, so a strong relationship between the extent to which the country had really gritty streets and the negative impact of growing up in cities. So, for example, Argentina really stood out. Argentina's top capital cities the main cities are all very, very gritty. And indeed, in Argentina, there's a big effect of growing up inside cities. Whereas if you take Ireland or Switzerland or other countries, there's very little effect of growing up inside cities, because their city streets are much more windy. I think Ireland, in our set of world countries, had the highest post-disorder.
Really? I wonder Vienna, because Vienna is also not gritty. Vienna is also, I think, around in circles. Yeah.
Absolutely. So the data from that study, we published that in Nature in 2022, because we'd be able to dive down and do all sorts of things with the data. Really suggests that if you're growing up in Vienna, it's improving your navigation skill compared to growing up in Buenos Aires or Manhattan, that your brain is being forced to think more about the space around you to find your way.
That's so interesting. But even that made me think of something completely different, because I thought about the gritty, the grit, and I thought about that. It's almost as if you can project the thinking, it's almost as if you are okay, there's a structure and you can go according to a structure, but suddenly when the structure is away, then you don't have these points where you can focus on, to get to the next point. And it actually made me think, and this is just a hypothesis of how it also relates to people who are artists, who are self-taught, and artists who are, go to university or are being taught. Because this fascinates me also over all the interviews that I've done, is that you get the artists who are initially self-taught and they go on to become jazz musicians, or they are much more sort of open to experimenting with their art and doing something different. And they're also very much their own person. They're very authentic, very stick to what they want and stick to what they want to do, even if they go on to study later on. But if they initially started as self-taught, and then you get these, and also excellent musicians, excellent artists, very doing outstanding work, but they were taught from the beginning, from the start, but they sort of had to go through a period of time to find themselves, to find their voice, to find who they are. And I was always thinking of that, what makes the one more daring from a very early age to the other one. And when I heard this interview, I sort of thought about that. Can you draw the line to that as well? People learning in a grid, basically, in a structure, and people not learning in a structure.
No, I think it does have parallels. That's that's a really nice point you make. I think the point of that research was that here we were able to measure something very precise and look across hundreds of thousands of people to be confident that we found something. But what it implies is not just that space, the gritty cities matter, but that very likely there are many facets of your early childhood, up to but before you become an adult, that changed your cognitive approach, like how you approach the world and what you can do in the world. And we don't tend to think about it. It's quite hard to find these experiments to test hundreds of thousands of people. And some things will have a bigger effect than others. What your parents tell you is going to be really, really impactful, very likely. But just your exposure to nature around you, if you grow up in a really busy city, is likely to change the way your life is. There's going to be impacts. But you're right, the capacity of kind of whether you were trained to be an artist or you self-taught yourself, they're going to really have a long-lasting impact across your whole life. It would seem very likely. So it's a really good parallel. Yeah, I think we need to know more. But it's hard to do these studies. But yeah, it's a very good question.
But so what do you do now with the results? When you find the results, how is this implemented?
What are we doing having found that result?
Yeah.
One direction we're going in is to think, so far we've been kind of measuring people, asking them to tell us things about them, and you make discoveries. That's different from saying, could we improve people's ability? So if you grew up in a city and you'd like to improve your navigation skill, or if you've just grown up in rural, you want to improve your navigation skill, what can you actually do? So one study we're involved in now is thinking about how can we help people improve their navigation. And for me, that's not just, oh, great, I can find my way now. That's one of the features of training people. The other one is the deeper connection to the landscape around you. I think that is the people I've worked with who are really good navigators, they have a much deeper connection to the world around them. And I mean that. I mean this both in a kind of working with indigenous groups who, I could talk more about so we're working on a project in the Marshall Islands where people are moving between tropical atolls and living in a very different lifestyle. And there's parallels between people who are living in a landscape that involves the sea with London taxi drivers who sit behind the wheel of a London taxi. But in London, our taxi drivers have to, by law, sit an exam where they have to remember 26,000 street names and how they're all connected. So it's a very intense profession between becoming a London taxi driver. And for me, the combination of these two groups of people where navigation is really important is that they feel differently about the space around them. Not only are they empowered to just know where they're going, but they feel the space, their
Mm-hmm.
ownership of the how they exist in the world has been changed. And I think for me, I would like to see both the upskilling of confidence and independence and navigating, but also a better connection to the world around us. And through that, I think those two things are linked. That if you rely entirely on a sat nav, if I'm trying to find my way
Yeah.
around, I don't really have to think about where I'm going. Then it reduces my connection to the world out there and isn't using the best of my brain capacity. That said, I would also say the value of those digital tools has probably saved a lot of motorway crashes and people being
Yeah.
late, and the stress of navigation has really gone down with them. So they've been hugely useful. But I think there's a journey in our society globally to really have people feel more independent and able to navigate their environment. And hopefully we can find new ways to do that. So that's one of the directions in the research is going. We don't know. It's not been done yet. There's no manual I can give you or test and say or training to say this is how you can improve your navigation skill. So that's
But
one of the
would
directions going.
yeah, would this also be something that could be implemented in schools, for example, in education?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, no doubt. And that's a really good question because
Mhm.
if you're training someone late in life to do it, that could be still very useful. But the best place to catch people is going to be in their early life in schools. So it is something we should think about for schools.
But tell me now, Hugo, how do you come up with the questions that
Mm.
you want to ask? Is this because you also have to have a creative mind to be able to ask these questions.
Yeah, I noticed in your interviews, that's a really lovely question that people respond to is where do your ideas for the artwork, or in my case, the science come from? And I have got quite interested in where that I think they can come anywhere. They often are, I think, at a time I'm just wandering around, wandering in my house,
Okay.
I'm not typically sitting like talking to somebody,
Mm.
but it is a very like it can just be maybe I'm brushing my teeth and suddenly an idea pops into my head
Okay.
that oh gosh, we could do this. We could actually ask this question, or oh, I never thought about that. Why don't we do that? I think early in my career, I found it very worrying as a PhD student. I wasn't sure I'd make it into science because I could see all these creative people around me coming up with exciting experiments. And I thought, I can't really, it's a real struggle to come up with these. And what I've realized, and this probably applies to artists, is the more experience you have, the more you've been doing a profession, the more you've engaged and seen things, read things, you have this huge back knowledge, in your unconsciously in your mind and your brain, of course, that can come up with things. Things can
Oh,
surface
yeah.
that allow you to be creative and put things together.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think it's just I wouldn't have described myself as a creative scientist early in my career, but now I feel I've done a number of experiments and things where I'm quite proud of what we achieved, and often they're just a thought I've had in a bathroom, or
Oh, yeah.
wandering, sitting, having a coffee somewhere, and thinking, well. But I think it's quite hard to force it. If you said, right, we're going to go and do a brainstorming
Oh,
event, and
yeah.
what experiments can we do today?
Mm.
I've never done that in my career. I've always just let ideas come. Uh,
Mm.
it helps to have very creative colleagues to bounce ideas off too. That's certainly the case. But I've
But
also found I've tried to work cross-disciplinary. So I work with anthropologists, architects, visual
oh,
artists,
okay. Mm.
geographers. Um, I'm collaborating with a particle physicist at the moment. So a lot of different disciplines give you very different perspectives into the science, and it's wonderful. It's a really incredible thing to see an idea, and put it together.
But I also always think that art and science is not so. or is very much interlinked, that we think it's different, but it's not. And I can also, and I realize this also, how, you talk about paint and color and it's a science, and you talk about pottery and the clay and the heating of the, how you heat the clay and bake the clay. And it's a science. And many artists, they talk about this fact that there's so much around just creating the art, that the knowledge and the science behind it. And I also think in education, that we need that creative side of things to be able to have scientists who have a creative thinking and come up with these ideas and come up with the answers to many things that we are asking,
Yeah, no, I agree completely. Yeah, it's vitally important. You can do some very dull science, or presumably not such an engaged art, if you're not really putting your mind to it properly and letting the creative process really play out. So one of the directions my research has gone very recently is into actually, instead of just studying how people navigate spaces, how do those spaces affect people's creativity? So we've been running studies. So looking at the literature other people have published, there's a lot of literature coming out that natural environments, so environments with trees or plants or just natural images or pictures of landscapes into real spaces, can restore people's capacity to think. They're more relaxing. They can really help restore people, but also possibly allow them to be more creative. And it's a very sort of new area of research. And people may have been asking this for a while, but not, I think, as systematically as it could have been. So we've been trying to run experiments to find out whether, if you take a room and you have it designed, as it is by, say, a university, or you take the research literature and you say, okay, if we're going to make this creative, here are the elements we should put into the space. And a lot of those elements are for example, putting wooden tables in, putting artwork in that's got patterns to it that are reflective of nature, or potentially, images of landscapes, and light and so on. All these sort of getting the right levels of light and comfort and things that are just, and the right materials, the softer materials, and color tones that would reflect nature. And so green hues and blue hues. And so for us, the question was, if you transform a space from a standard, office type space to something like this, are people more creative in that space? And so what we've done to explore that is to have people write narratives. So be creative, come up with a fictitious story. And we've been looking to see whether are people actually more creative when they're in a biophilic, as described, like an environment that is, with natural features that people feel typically attracted to. But the other crucial thing is who. It's presumably not a universal, and are there some people where it's more impactful than others. So I think the creativity question is a really important one. If we can get an understanding of what, for some people, will help them be creative, and for others that we need to, that the standard approach is everyone just got to go to an office and work in an office. But people need different environments, I think, to do different tasks. And I think there's an acknowledgement that different people need different spaces. And so having flexibility in a workspace is probably going to be something we'll see in the future to address that. So we're still in the middle of running and analyzing all the data we've got, but it's been a real joy to think about that problem of how are we going to test people's creativity, what would creative look like, and how might the environment influence them. So that's one of the kind of research lines we've gone into recently.
But that would be very interesting, because if I ask artists, and I'm not just talking about painters, but you would ask what inspires, and then it would be, like a painter the other day, her garden, and all her paintings has got florals on it, and somebody else, a singer-songwriter that I spoke to in Ireland, said the rain inspires him. And you think all these different things, inspire different people, but they're around it. It's in their surrounding, or it's something that they connected to, and that brings out this art. And so that would be amazing if you have that in office buildings, and really focus on what do you want from people in that office.
Absolutely. I think that is a really untapped way of looking at people. For a long time, sort of office has been looked at as production, like producing things.
Yeah.
But actually, in the world we live in now, it's about being creative with things. And for me, it's the administrative staff I work with in the university who are doing a lot of producing documents and filling in reports. They have to be creative too. They need to think. It's not a job where you just hit the buttons. So even what you might think of, oh, it'd be great if professors had great offices, to think it's not. It's the whole of our society. Of anybody in a workplace needs to have the best environment, I think, to help that. And I don't think these are costs. We're not talking about building forests for people to live in.
Yeah.
We're talking about very clever interventions that can be cost effective, and make a big difference to people's lives. So I'm hoping this research allows us to go further and really help boost creativity, not, for artists and scientists, but the broader population as well.
Well, it's everything around us is art, so we might as well tap into to all these things. So, But tell me, Hugo, the young Hugo, 10-year-old, were you inquisitive at that age as well?
Yeah, I think my mother always said I wanted to be an explorer,
Is it?
Yeah. And so I never became an actual explorer. But in a sense, I've been exploring the brain and what's going on in the brain for most of my career. But yeah, at 10, I'm trying to think, I was at school enjoying life, and around that age reading The Lord of the Rings and, Tolkien's imaginary world had a big influence on me, interested in maps, and creating landscapes. Yeah.
And science, were you always interested in science?
Yeah, both my parents had done PhDs, so I grew up with these PhDs sitting on the shelf and wondering what, and taking me to science lectures, and maybe not at 10, but a bit later. My mother moved on to being a psychotherapist, and my father decided to become a manager of a butterfly farm. So they didn't stay in science. My father worked in genetics, my mother in electron microscopy, and they just both moved on to broader careers. But that left this real interest in science. Like, there was always a sense of, talking about biology or going to buildings or meeting people who were working in science. So we weren't constantly surrounded by scientists, but it was certainly seen in the family as something, oh, you could just go and do a PhD. It would be very boring. It wouldn't be a surprise if you decided to do a PhD from my parents.
But that's also that thing where you know where you can go. I think it's always that important thing also for young people to know and to be exposed to something that they can see there's the possibility.
That's really true. Yeah, that's very, very important, to expose people to options and possibilities. And yeah, I really agree with that.
I remember also in the Royal Ballets, my children went to the Royal Ballet School, but there were always the pictures of the dancers, the principal dancers, and they went to do performances on the Royal Ballet stage, and I always thought of that. I thought, okay, so here you are as a child, you don't know where you're going to, but there is a possibility that because you see the pictures, you see the end result almost. And I think that is so important also for young people, to know the possibility.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah. Now, it's on my mind of my children, how I've got 3 children, and one of them is now 18, so an adult. But it is trying to think about what it is I can do to help. And it's not as easy. I was in my mind, right, great, I'll do lots of activities, but it's not as easy as we think. And so I think that does need to be valued more. And I'm always thinking I need to make more time to do that sort of engagement. So, yeah.
But your children, are they also like you, inquisitive? Do they
Yeah.
see really?
Yeah, I can see that in them. Yeah, absolutely. As a parent as well, it's been wonderful watching them draw things. All three of them have got this really interesting way of drawing, and I really noticed that my middle child, Grace, is the way she draws things. I couldn't. There's a certain confidence, the way of laying out a lion that just naturally comes to her, and it looks fantastic. And if I tried to do it, I wouldn't make it as good as she
Really?
does it.
Mm.
And as she gets older, she might change the way she's trying to draw it more accurately, and it will lose some of that vibrancy. I don't know. We'll see. So I've seen, my youngest daughter, we'll see how she gets on with, she's, you know, does fantastic drawings too in a different style. So having seen three children draw, it's incredible. I've got next to my desk here a huge box of all their
Really?
drawings and paintings. I think I'm going to look back at these for a long time now. I think it's really
Yeah.
amazing to have children's drawings.
I homeschooled my children, and I kept all their essays and
Mm.
their little notes that they wrote, and
Mhm.
I put it all in a file, and I went back, um, you know, many times and look at what they wrote and how they saw the world and how they saw the future and how things planned out for them, and also their drawings. You can read so much into the drawings, and
Mm.
yeah, so it's lovely. It's wonderful to see that.
Privilege.
That's
Mm.
why I'm so passionate about the fact that children should have the possibility at a young age and in school, that we value art more and that we put art alongside sciences and maths, because I think it's so important that, for example, in your career, that we have creatives in the sciences and, to come up with all these answers that you come up with.
Mm. No, I
Mm.
agree. I think all these things need to be for human flourishing, of like how we can all live the best possible life, and for ourselves and the planet is a big constraint. Um, Having that exposure to both art and science and other activities that humans can do, it's really important. Yeah, it's really not to be underestimated, the value of these things.
But Hugo, you are a professor of cognitive neuroscience.
Hmm.
Is it at UCL?
That's right.
Yeah. And so now for you, what is the dream? What is the big wish?
Mm. One area I've got really into thinking more about is connecting more with Indigenous communities.
Mm.
So I spent quite a bit of my career working with London taxi drivers, and they are a traditional community in the sense they go back to 1858 is when they started training.
Really?
Yep. So
Mm.
so they are
With horse and carriage.
with horses and carriages. They started
Mm.
sitting an exam that made them memorize all the streets in London,
Wow.
hold it, and I think it's a real treasure of London, like the Tower Bridge
Yeah.
and Big Ben. We have these black taxis in London, the cabs, and the people that drive them are called cabbies. And there's been more and more women now. A good number of taxi drivers are women in London, which is great to see. But these people are impressive because they spend 2 years training to memorize these streets. So throughout my career, going back to many years back, coming to 20 years ago, I started working with taxi drivers, studying this community in London. But I've become more interested in recent years into thinking about what can we learn from Indigenous groups in other parts of the world. And so I've been starting to form collaborations there. And I think, for example, the point is that so much of the research on cognitive neuroscience is about people like me sitting in London, sitting in a Western environment, living with Google Maps and digital internet, and sitting looking at it. So it's a very particular group of people in the world. It is a dominant group. A lot of the planet is now like this, but throughout our history, people have done remarkable things, and there continue to be groups in the world who are much more connected to the landscape and have a real traditional past going back generations where there is knowledge that can be lost. People have got skills and things that we just haven't really tapped into. And so there's a lot of fantastic work, of course, in anthropology and in ethnography, looking at understanding these cultures. That's going back. What I think's been missing is the kind of understanding, the systematic understanding of people's minds in these cultures. So a lot of the anthropology will ask people, how did you do that? And then they'll say, this is how I did that. But that's not what we do in cognitive neuroscience or psychology. We don't just ask taxi drivers, how did you do that? We're interested in, if we ask them to do this puzzle, why is it they're faster here than this? They're very slow, but here they were very fast. Why is that the case? And so with a recent research study, we were able to work with a team that can take apart the structure of the city streets and take some modeling, some what we call computational modeling, to mathematically work out how the streets are structured, and then explained the inner workings of the mind of the taxi driver in terms of how they think. So that's with taxi drivers. So where I'm really excited to go is start to reach out to broader communities across the planet and work with indigenous people who are local experts as well. So I'm not just flying in, getting the data. This is called helicopter science. If I just fly in, ask some people something and leave, that's really not good for the planet or for eroding the cultures you're working with. So I think for me, it's a real challenge to work with multiple communities around our planet to understand what they can offer us. But I think in this world we now live in, with extensive AI, artificial intelligence has exponentially gone up with large language models like ChatGPT or Gemini. There's real questions about how these are trained on particular data and don't really absorb that traditional knowledge. So, and it's also that issue about independence we talked earlier about. Can we allow people to understand the world around them and connect more and be more confident to find their way and not just rely on sat-navs? That links back to these traditional cultures. But just to end on that story, I think in thinking about it in terms of science and art, when you come to studying, for my area, like wayfinding, how you find your way in the Pacific Ocean between atolls is an art. It's not. There's a science of how you can use and guide a boat and how taxi drivers plan their routes. It's a learned skill, but there it's codified with culture for thousands of years, and linked to religion and an entire sense of who you are and why you are where you are. And I reflect on a lot. So the direction our research team are going is to really work more with Indigenous communities to understand, help us broaden our understanding of what it is to be human and what humans can do, and tell that story as well in a scientific addition to the anthropology that's been fantastic. So that's one direction. But it's coming back to the podcast. Your podcast it is working with an arts perspective. It can just be coming in and measuring people's brains and saying, "Oh, forget what they said about religion. The religion is part of the story about how they navigate." So and the way they create artifacts, beautiful bits of art, are really a part of the story of Indigenous communities and how they navigate and relate to the world.
Well, I just recently spoke to a Ndebele artist. Well, he's a producer. He makes films, but about his community and about his culture also, highlighting. And he was talking also about the Ndebele tribe and how the women instinctively paint, the houses, all these colors, and they do beadwork and how they dress and so on. And it's not taught. It comes from within, and I think it's so important that we understand and have also appreciation for that. And I think that, like you were saying with the AI situation, I have also been noticing the past months how people were talking about authenticity and about speaking, what they want to say through their music or through their art and so on. And I think we suddenly realized that there's so much more around us that we haven't explored yet, and that we want that human side, and we want to see these things, these authentic things from people.
I agree. That's exactly it. That's a really well put point. Yeah.
But that investigation that you want to do now, I would think that would be very interesting. So, also exploring other cultures and connecting it. What you said about also that the science can't explain anything. Everything. I've also spoke to winemakers, and you also realize there that the same vineyard can produce different wines just because of the winemaker, just because of the person behind it. And I've also spoken to pilots and asking, yes, everybody can fly, but not everybody can be a pilot, and you ask yourself, so that is something that is so scientific, actually, flying and the airplane, the aircraft, but still there's something that somebody has that's a type of intuition or something that we don't understand that makes them be able to fly that plane, so that's also for me very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the point there for me would be that it's important to recognize and value that people's beliefs and how they see the world, and not just say, oh, that's nonsense, or that's not going to be, that doesn't fit with current models of the way the science sees the world. I mean, fundamentally, the way I have approached this and worked with artists before is that the science is there to measure things. So what will happen in the future, we can measure something and we can predict what will happen down the line. But if science is doing well, it allows us to think, it allows us to do all the medicines we have in the world. It allows us to build the buildings. There's a huge amount of fantastic outcomes in the science, but it is about measurement. And so if you can't measure something, it doesn't, and because you can't measure it, it doesn't mean it's wrong or it's not. I
understand what you mean.
I think the other wonderful thing I've found working with artists is on projects is the science. Of course, the further you go, the better you're successful, the more explaining you've done. So you've explained this thing you've achieved, and your images you're producing in the scientific work. It's a big failure if people don't exactly understand what you've shown. If I'm showing a map of a street and people took a route, I want the reader to know, oh, they went from here to here, and it's very clear. If I've done a bad image if you're trying to create a really interesting piece of artwork, if it's entirely explainable, that's a failure. It's the opposite.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right? So it should be mysterious. It should be engaged. It should provoke questions. So there is this wonderful tension in that sense, but they are related. There's a sense in which the scientific images I try and create, I really do try and work to make them really engaging, and that people visually think, oh, I want to know. This is mysterious. I want to find out. But ultimately, it does need to be explainable. But in the little bits of work I've done with artists, that has been a wonderful release. Created images and shapes. We've done some work on, with glass sculpture and projections of images into glass with collaborators. And there isn't the constraint to explain at all. And so I really think, again, those experiences made me really value art and artists even more. That capacity to come up with something that just engages with the viewer or the listener or the reader, and they're lost into the other world, I think is just magic.
Yeah, and it's true what you're saying, because also many artists have said to me that they speak about the art, but then if somebody else comes up with this totally different interpretation than they actually meant for it to be, but then they're happy about that. They're happy to hear. Yeah,
that would be the experience I've had with very good artists, is that it is there to be, it's created, but it is, if it's good, it will create more. It's not a so I think that's a wonderful difference between the art and the science. There's so many overlaps, but I think it's a wonderful, they both have these different kind of points, that science is trying to measure things and make predictions about measurements that will happen in the future. As in, your pain, if you take this paracetamol, your pain will go down. It's a predict, and it works generally. Paracetamol is a very effective painkiller, but a beautiful painting, is not there to just make someone feel good. That's not a successful painting. It's there to provoke and to engage and draw on people's experience. I think that's my take on what the huge value in art is in our culture.
Exactly. Hugo, have you asked questions or wanted to get an answer from an experiment, but then you get totally a different outcome than you expected?
Oh, that's a nice one. I mean, I guess one we're writing up now is about the navigation training, and that's a bit of a boring one in the sense we thought we could train people up to be really good at navigating with the right skill. We'd read a lot, written up, and in that case, I won't explain the full experiment. We tried to train people up, and we found nothing. Like
Really?
it was completely failed. Didn't make people worse, but the intervention we ran had no effect whatsoever on helping people, and so. I found that quite fun. I wouldn't do science if every experiment we ran worked. It just,
I see. Yeah.
somehow I've been doing something very boring where we all knew what the outcome was, or I was maybe, that would be strange. I've never known anyone who's not had failed experiments. So it doesn't get talked about enough, actually, as the joy of failed experiments, in that they tell you something. I've heard Nobel Prize winners talk about things that gone wrong.
Really?
They did not get the result they anticipated at all. And then they've really puzzled over it. And that sometimes has led to a Nobel Prize in that it's interpreting the data. What do you get back? And I've also heard Nobel Prize winners talk about the reason they have been successful, they think, is that they didn't just get hooked into a way of thinking. They were more able to see patterns and interpret them in multiple ways. And that is a real challenge in science because you get quite siloed and there's a way of the field. It's true. I think Nobel Prize winners are better at seeing things and thinking differently. What might this be? Is there a completely different way of seeing this? So, yeah, I don't know if I've gone on a tangent to your question.
No, but is it something? Is it sort of because you want to prove something? Is it, that you sort of get stuck in, but I want to prove it. I want to prove my hypothesis.
Yeah, I think that's exactly, well, yes, that's right. You invest a lot of, so you say, I think we will see this. Here's our experiment hypothesis. And so you invest 2 years of your life sometimes or more.
Yeah.
Find out the answer to that. And if the answer is no, it feels like you failed and it was a lot, because in science it's quite hard to publish what we call a null result, where there was no effect. So we will write up this research paper, but we're not going to send it to the world's best journal, because the reason is that maybe we didn't do it well enough. Maybe it just wasn't implemented quite right, and that there's more reasons why it wouldn't work than it would. And so generally, there's a kind of, it's hard to publish those null results, but generally, yeah, people are keen to find something that fits what they were expecting, and then they can write it up and send it off and move on with their career. But as I said, it's quite important to be flexible in your thinking and look over the information you're getting, the data that comes back, and think, what's this telling me? And don't jump to the first conclusions.
Yeah. But what I also now think about it, I not usually realize is that it takes a long time. Like you say now, it takes about 2 years to do a specific experiment. So how do you keep yourself motivated to carry on, if you maybe get to obstacles or so on?
So as you go further in your career as a scientist, you become a professor, and then you don't have to worry about that anymore, because you have so many projects going on that if many fail, you're not feeling like it's such a problem. So that for me is never really, I don't worry and sit and think, oh gosh, and you could have a whole sequence of failed experiments. I think the worry often is that the worries you have as a scientist about is more about, did we get the design of the experiment right? So you spend a lot of
Oh, I
time
see.
tweaking away, thinking we've got to ask this, or we've got to make sure this control condition, this extra measure we're going to take, is in there. That's what worries you. Once you've done all that and you're off collecting the data, it's you've not got the chance to change it often. It can be difficult. But early in your career, I think it is hard as a scientist to think you've got all this investment of your time. What if it doesn't work? And the solution, certainly in my research team, is to make sure that people have multiple projects, some that's their main project and side projects, and they're involved in multiple teams and people are working across projects. They're not all on their own. So if you're just you and your project, I think that's psychologically really quite hard. Um, I've certainly done projects in my career like that when I was junior, and it's nice to have a team around you to think. So yeah, it gets easier as you get further into science. You've got more projects, more irons in the fire.
But amazing work. I really think what you're doing is amazing, and the things that I've heard, and you speak about, and thank you so much for your time, and thank you for explaining all this to me.
No, it's a huge pleasure. Really lovely to talk to you about it all, and the questions have been, and the points you made are absolutely spot on.
Oh, thank you so much.